What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel.
Alright, so Black Widow, Moon Knight, and Aquaman, the Rob Core 3 Rob 0. I never would have read an Aquaman story. One of the things that I promised myself with my whole reinvigoration, my whole interest in Comics Explained after Disney World, was that I would give people more of an opportunity to contribute to the channel. That's why I have that bumper that says, hey, hit the sub button, you can offer suggestions, so on and so forth, because I wanted people to feel more involved. And Aquaman is a really good example of that. If this were a year and a half ago, I would have been like, Aquaman Rebirth? Nope, not a chance, not a chance. But dude, it's good. Dude, Aquaman Rebirth is so good. Okay, so here's the whole deal about this. Aquaman Rebirth is the best thing coming out of DC Rebirth right now. And the reason why is because it emphasizes his character more so than any way that we've seen before. And this really emphasizes the idea of Aquaman trying to create more of a bridge, both literally and figuratively, with the United States. Initially, this kind of picks up with Arthur Curry and Mera, I'm not really sure how you pronounce it. However, I think it's however you want to pronounce it, but it picks up with the two of them, and they're kind of debating this idea of the next step. But we don't really know what the next step is. It's just kind of the two of them working together, trying to get things sorted out, trying to understand what this bigger picture needs to be. Now, the cool thing here is they're hanging out in Amnesty Bay, and Amnesty Bay has always been a huge part of Aquaman's mythos in the sense that this is a surface-born guy to an Atlantean mother and a human father. He always kind of had to split the world, and so with Amnesty Bay, it's kind of like his Batcave, his fortress of solitude. It's his own little place. But then you also have Atlantis, which is kind of him being king. We'll get a little bit more in terms of how he functioned as a king in New 52 versus DC Rebirth. But what we do is we have Black Manta essentially watching all these events unfold. Now, this is the cool thing about what Dan Abnett does, because the Black Manta as a villain, he's like Aquaman's main guy. I would say he's Aquaman's main bad guy. Some might say it's Ocean Master. It might kind of go back and forth. I mean, Ocean Master is blood relative. Black Manta is just like a guy whose father Aquaman killed. And so because of that, it's just kind of like this blood vendetta. But the whole first issue of this is kind of focusing on that. But the bigger picture that Aquaman and Mera are talking about is basically Spindrift Station, which is an embassy for Atlantis on the surface. And as far as I'm aware, and after going through, doing Aquaman Explained, as far as I'm aware, there's never been an instance where Aquaman has opened the borders of Atlantis to the surface world. That's almost never happened. I don't think it's ever happened before. The closest that Atlantis ever comes to the surface world is during an attack. Throne of Atlantis is a really good example. When Aquaman abdicated his throne, decided to be a full-time member of the Justice League, and his brother Orm basically took his place, which led to, Atlantis invading the United States. Aside from that, it's always just him, it's always Atlantis remaining in isolation. And what's happening here is there are various emissaries that are coming from nations around the world for the purpose of, from the United States rather, for the purpose of going into Atlantis and getting a better feel for things. Some of them are going to serve political roles where they speak on behalf of the president or something like that, and they basically serve as ambassadors. Others will play more of a political role in terms of understanding, getting a better idea of the goings-on of Atlantis in everyday life, and then reporting back accordingly. For example, there is a guy that's introduced to us here by the name of Ray Delane, and Ray Delane works for the Daily Planet, and the job is to basically just do an article about what life is like inside Atlantis. And this really goes into Aquaman's whole mythos. What he's basically doing here, the reason why this embassy has been opened, is because the first step to really bridging the gap between Atlantis and the United States, as well as eventually the rest of the world, is giving people an idea of what Atlantis is like. Because remember, when it comes to Atlantis in DC Comics, it's very, very ambiguous. It's very hush-hush, cloak and dagger. Almost no one in the rest of the world knows what Atlantis is like, certainly not your average person. Aquaman wants to give them an idea so they can better, piece together their various means and so on and so forth and create, a stronger relationship here. The issue is that once some of the food is served, a particular thing called El Aqua, I think is what they call it, the guy Ray Delane actually ends up getting sick and just kind of goes off and pukes in a corner. But then once he's sought out by one of the lieutenants named Sark, we find out this is not Ray Delane. Instead, this guy basically killed Ray Delane, threw him in the trunk of his car. This is actually Black Manta, and Black Manta is essentially launching an attack against Atlantis. Now, with this particular strike that he's implementing, it's for the sole purpose of destroying Aquaman's credibility. His idea is to bring down this embassy to kill individuals, kill Mera if he can, and then bring down everything that Aquaman loves. And the cool thing is that Dan Abnett plays in fast and loose, right? I mean, when you're going through this, you read issue number 1, you're like, really, Black Manta and Aquaman again. We've seen this fight so many times. There's a reason why Dan Abnett does this in the first issue. If it was really going to be like the battle between Aquaman and Black Manta, this would happen in issue number 6 at the end of the volume, at the end of the story arc. Instead, it happens right in the very beginning. And the reason why is because this is not the main brunt of the story. There's so much more that goes on. Instead, with this facility being partially destroyed, water flooding in, a little under a dozen being injured, as well as some dying, Aquaman's able to fight off Black Manta. There's not a whole lot here, but it's Dan Abnett giving us a stance on what to expect with the two characters. Of course, we'll see Black Manta return, especially with what unfolds in the story, but it's Dan Abnett telling us there's basically a blood feud here, that because of the fact that Aquaman had killed the father of Black Manta says he's gonna hunt him forever. But the beautiful thing is Dan Abnett says that's the way it used to be. We'll have to change the motive of Black Manta later on down the line. But for right now, you know, Aquaman says this is really pointless. And it's Dan Abnett pointing to the idea that when it came to the character of Aquaman and Black Manta, all they've ever done is fight. That's all they ever do is fight. There's no grandiose story. The stories are mediocre at best when the two of them go against each other. It's just, and Black Manta's here, and now Black Manta and Aquaman are fighting, rinse, repeat. And so what Dan Abnett says is, we're changing the status quo. All right, we're changing all this up. Aquaman sits down, like once he gets the upper hand, he sits down with him and says, dude, you're wasting your life. With the kind of skill you have, your skills in stealth, subterfuge, espionage, the fact that you could infiltrate this embassy and succeed in injuring Mera, let alone going, you know, equal and hand-to-hand combat to Aquaman, proves the kind of potential you have. Put it to good use, man. Do something with yourself. Do something with your life. Because right now, what Aquaman says is like, Black Manta, you're consumed with vengeance. You know, it's one of these things where somebody does you wrong and you want to take revenge on them. Well, once that revenge is satisfied, well then what? There is no satisfaction. You know, Aquaman says there's nothing you could do that would make you happy. There's no way you could kill me that would make you happy. You could tie me up in a room and torture me for a month and you would still walk away feeling empty-handed. You would still walk away feeling dissatisfied. What Aquaman says is, look, I'm sorry I killed your father. I was young, I was dumb, I made a stupid decision, I acted rashly, I should have thought everything through. What he says is, do not make that mistake. Reconcile with yourself. Understand that your father's gone. Be angry, lash out, do whatever you want to do, but recognize that who I am now is a totally different person from who I was before. Now, of course, these are no real words of comfort for Black Manta. I mean, he kind of throws it down and says, okay, fine, and seems to walk away. But in the midst of him being transported, he's basically grabbed by a group led by Blackjack, a group or at least operating under the name of Nemo. Now, I jumped on Twitter because I had to ask this question to people. I had no idea. I knew the concept of Nemo, but as far as I'm aware in DC Comics, Nemo was an actual guy. It was never an organization. And so I had to hit people up and I kind of got mixed responses. Some said it's like a reimagining of Nemo as he existed in DC Comics. Some were saying it's a brand new organization. It looks like it's a new organization, but we'll get a little more into that because the great thing is Dan Abnett gives us a little bit of an explanation on what Nemo's about and what to expect going forward. But regarding the aftermath of Black Manta's acts with this embassy being damaged and the loss of life with regards to American people, one of the commanders of the Drift, which is like Aquaman's elite guard, ends up traveling back to the embassy and they won't let him in. The US military will not let him in. Now, of course, when Aquaman shows up, Aquaman's question is, why can't we get in there? And because he's the king, he actually gets some answers. But basically what they tell him is, because of what happened, there was a loss of life, there was damage that was there, we're shutting down the embassy. And that's par for the course. I mean, that's what would happen. You know, if there were an embassy here in the United States, if the embassy belonged to like, you know, country X, and then an occupant from country X came to the United States and launched a massive attack against that embassy, they would shut it down. And they would say, this embassy on American soil is now closed. No one gets in, no one gets out. That's what we would expect. Aquaman's response is exactly what we would expect in the sense that he's kind of irritated over this. But the cool thing, and this is why it's so interesting, is Aquaman does not respond with violence. Instead, he takes this very diplomatic approach. Now, switching back to Black Manta, of course, after having been taken by Nemo, you know, as he's talking to this woman Blackjack, she says, look, we have mutual interests. We'd like to make you a part of our group. And this is cool because this is Dan Abnett finally giving like purpose to Black Manta, right? I mean, he was just the guy that fought Aquaman. That was Black Manta's thing. You know, it was the old adage, you know, people, you know, the people that never read Aquaman were like, Aquaman talks to fish, Black Manta fights Aquaman. That's just the way their characters went hand in hand. Now, of course, you walk up to an Aquaman fan and you're like, yeah, man, Aquaman, that's the guy that talks to fish, right? They'll freak. He doesn't talk to fish. Aquaman doesn't talk to fish. Like they'll freak. Like they'll lose their minds, you know, because they're like, Aquaman stories are so deep and rich and so much better than that. They'll freak. You know, it's kind of funny. It's funny to see, to be honest, but they'll lose their minds on you, but rightfully so, because Aquaman doesn't talk to fish. Aquaman's the guy that goes toe to toe with Superman is what it is in this story. But the fact remains here that Manta easily overpowers a couple of these guards from Nemo. And of course, this is when Blackjack says, hey, look, you know, you seem a lot more assertive than we thought you were. Come with me and we'll take you to meet the boss. Now, switching back to Aquaman, this is when we kind of continue to pick up with this whole thing. Aquaman, you know, in realizing that the base of the embassy has been shut down, travels to the the White House to see the President of the United States. The issue is he doesn't get that far. You don't just walk up to the White House and ask to speak to the President of the United States. No one does that. You have to make a meeting ahead of time, so on and so forth. And so he ends up meeting with the Chief of Staff, a man by the name of Mr. Gantry or Mr. Jantry, however you want to pronounce it. But he ends up meeting with him, and it's this really interesting give and take situation, because Jantry's stance is that, hey, look, like there was an attack at the embassy. Sure, that embassy was yours, but it was on American soil. There was a terrorist attack by an Atlantean, or at least somebody who was believed to be Atlantean, on American soil. And he says, we need to rethink the relationship. We're shutting down the entirety of this embassy, and whatever happens will happen. But for right now, no one's in and no one's out. While this takes place, there is a United States ship that's attacked by a rogue group. Now, of course, this group basically calls itself the Deluge. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, the Deluge is like a rogue faction, a radical faction within Atlantis. They're purists. They are members of the Atlantean race that basically say we need to have no interaction with the surface world whatsoever. Arthur Curry is a traitor. We do not recognize the leadership of our king because he's going against the traditional standard of Atlantis, which is to be isolationist, which is to remain isolated from the rest of the world. And so in response to this, they basically do everything they can to sabotage the rule of Aquaman as king of Atlantis. And in this instance, because he's trying to create a peaceful alliance with the United States, attacking this ship will destroy that. And the reason why is because 30 minutes after this attack happens, and after the Deluge makes a claim for it, Aquaman is arrested by the State Department and literally taken to prison for this. Now, keep in mind, Aquaman himself is not thrown in prison because of the fact that he's the one that committed the act. Aquaman's thrown in prison because he's the leader of the country, and people in the country committed the act. And that's how it functions. I mean, there are individuals, that will, from nations that will go commit rogue acts, but a lot of times governments will just say that other government needs to be held responsible until they choose to hand that individual over. Because of the fact that the alliance between the United States and Atlantis is so strained, because it almost doesn't exist at all, and because the surface world is so distrusting of Atlantis after stories like the Throne of Atlantis, where Atlantis attacked the United States and so on, Aquaman is basically being held for the actions of his own country. Now, the funny thing about this is that where one of the guys asks, hey, are there any special accommodations that you need? Trying to beat around the bush and ultimately asking, do you need water? Dan Abnett kind of pokes fun at the idea of how people view Aquaman, where he's like, well, I mean, I would like a fish to talk to, maybe a turbot, and if I'm deprived of whale song for more than 4 hours, then I'll become berserk. And I got a crack out of that when I saw it, because it's like and one of the guys is like, wow, he doesn't know how to respond. He's like, you really don't understand me at all. And it's Dan Abnett kind of poking fun. I mean, that's how it is. People who say like Aquaman talks to fish, it's Dan Abnett poking, like making fun of those people. Like he doesn't talk to fish. Like, why would you think that Aquaman would talk to fish? Now, of course, that's just a stigma left over from an archaic cartoon show, but the fact remains that it's just been a stigma of his character ever since. But it's funny to me. I couldn't help, but laugh a little bit. The other half of this is we kind of pick up with Mera. Now, of course, Mera is speaking directly with Tula, and this is kind of a cool thing here. Tula is basically Aquagirl, and Tula was introduced, really has been kind of reimagined several times over in DC Comics, but she's basically like the regent for Atlantis, which is to say that when the king and when Mera, his queen-to-be, are vacant from Atlantis itself, she rules in his stead. And that's the purpose of a regent. A regent is to basically rule in the absence of the sitting king, so that when the king returns, he'll return to a country or to a territory that's in working order. That's how we would hope it is. The problem is that over the course of world history, regents have basically usurped the role of king, so that when the king comes back, the regent has the king killed and basically takes his place, which is kind of a weird situation. But what Tula's also overseeing is the Drift investigating the wreckage of this particular ship, with all hands lost in the conflict. The problem is when they get there, they find a couple of relics from this this group, the Deluge, who consider themselves again to be purists. A lot of these relics dating back thousands and thousands of years. And this is when the Drift come to the realization that the Deluge are the ones behind all this. The problem is that in the middle of this investigation, American ships arrive on the scene to investigate the ship. And so because of this, it's really just a misunderstanding. You have Commander Mark, who's just like, hey, look, we're just investigating here. We're not here to actually do anything. But because of the distrust that humanity has with Atlanteans, as soon as they get there, they're trying to seize the ship. They're trying to take the ship. They're doing some sinister stuff. And it results in a battle between the two groups. Now, of course, Tula tells Commander Mark back off, because she's trying to maintain the stance that Aquaman left her in, which is do not do anything rash, do not initiate a conflict with the surface world, keep things under control, do not cause problems, because he's trying to solve this peacefully. What she does is she orders Commander Mark and his guys to basically vacate, but communication kind of seems to be scrambled, seem a bit lost here. Now, the other half of this is we basically pick up with Aquaman again. And Aquaman is speaking, of course, with one of the guys who's holding him captive here. And the question is, they ask, what can you tell us about a group called the Deluge? And this is when Aquaman basically says, hey, look, there are members of my own kingdom who do not follow my lead, who do not view me as a legitimate leader and try to depose me. Now, of course, this guy's response is exactly as we would expect it to be, like, well, how can we trust a king whose nation doesn't rally behind him? But Aquaman counters perfectly. He says, of course you have rebel factions that don't believe in you. You have rebel factions that don't follow your president. It doesn't mean that they're going to stay silent. They may act out, they may go on protests, whatever the case may be, minor violent, but the United States has its own history of violence against the federal government. You have people who have been violated by the federal government and react in turn. You have Ruby Ridge, Waco, Texas, Oklahoma City. These are just a handful of examples where people feel like they've been violated, where actions were committed against the federal government, whatever the case may be. It's just a circumstance where people act out, where they literally rebel against the US government, both violent and non-violent. And so because of this, Jantry is basically talking to Mera and saying, hey, look, your husband is guilty of war crimes against the United States. He may not have committed them, but he leads the land that did. And because of that, either you're going to work on our behalf or we're going to put you in the same place he is. And so where she's a little bit indignant here, where she basically, goes against him and says, hey, look, I'm not having anything to do with this. She basically, finds out where it is that he's being held and goes and breaks him out. Now, of course, this causes all kinds of problems for Aquaman because he's like, look, Mera, come on. Like, I know we're not married yet. We're gonna be, it's basically guaranteed, but he's like, I'm trying to solve this non-violently and you show up and break me out of prison. Well, of course, Mera says, look, you've tried your way. You've tried this non-violent. It's not working. If it was going to work, we wouldn't be where we are right now. Not only that, she says, look, there are factions that are operating against you out in Atlantis. The Regent Tula does not have the authority to keep them under control because she doesn't know how to be a leader the same way you do. And so she says, look, all roads are leading to a war and you're the only one that can bring it to an end. We've got to get you out of here for the sole purpose and for no other reason than to make sure the United States does not go to war with Atlantis. And so because of this, where Aquaman and Mera basically break their way out, they're confronted with a battalion of soldiers. Helicopters, tanks, infantry, the whole 9 yards. It's this full effort to basically seize them back under control. Now, the funny thing about this is that Aquaman is basically, he tells Mera, look, we can't kill these folks, but it's an interesting situation because we know they could. Like, we know they could take them out if they wanted to. We know how superheroes exist in relation to the and to normal humans, and that's what makes this so interesting. Aquaman is being diplomatic when he doesn't need to. Aquaman is extending an olive branch of peace when he doesn't need to. We're seeing that in Injustice right now. Injustice is a story where it sits down and it's superheroes basically saying, hey, humanity, like, our alliance walked the edge of a knife, but I'm Superman and I'm basically going to take over the world now. And humanity's response was, no, you can't conquer us. We have freedom. And Superman's response was, put your freedom in my hand. Show me your freedom. Show me where you have your freedom sitting in your house. Freedom is not a thing that you have. It's not a thing that you own. It's a concept you believe in. And your freedom, as you've experienced it, exists only because we've allowed you to have that. That's how freedom works in and of itself. Freedom is a concept people can enjoy until a force comes along that can take away their ability to enjoy it. When an opposing force comes and takes people's freedom, well, then it's not there anymore. It's not a tangible thing. Somebody doesn't break into your house and take your freedom. It's something that you believe in. And sure, you can say ideas don't die. Well, yeah, ideas don't die, but the ability to implement those ideas can die. Those can go away. Of what use is freedom to a group of people that can't practice it? And so it's one of those interesting situations when it comes to like superheroes, when it comes to, how they relate to humanity. And that's why I like this. But the whole basis behind this is Aquaman has to balance this. He has to say, yeah, sure, I could crush every last one of these soldiers. Like, I could obliterate every single one of them. I could destroy their tanks, their helicopters. I could kill every soldier on this battlefield. But all that's going to do is lead to a war between us and the United States. And that's not what I need. In response to this, Jantry's watching all these events unfold. The president contacts him and he says, you need to make that phone call, Mr. President. And we find out that this phone call that he's making is to Superman. Superman basically arrives and says, we need to have a conversation. We need to talk about this. Now, what's really cool is Aquaman, like how Aquaman sees himself is incredible in this part of the story, and I love that way Dan Abnett does this. Aquaman's perception of himself is a reflection of how, like, the average person views Aquaman, right? We talked about this. There are people who, for what, like they never saw Super Friends. They've never seen an episode in their life, or they've seen like a YouTube clip, and it's like Aquaman talks to fish. Like they hop on the bandwagon of, yeah, Aquaman talks to fish. Everybody else says he does, so I'll just assume they're telling the truth. And so because of that, he just got this bad stigma. People were making fun of him, and half the time they didn't even know why. It was just like, yeah, he's the guy that talks to fish. Aquaman sees himself as the black sheep of the Justice League because people say that about him. They're like, yeah, man, the Justice League, you got the Trinity. You got Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. You got the Flash, Cyborg, Green Lantern. Oh yeah, that's right, they have Aquaman. Yeah, whatever, who cares? Aquaman. guy talks to fish. Like it's it's how a lot of people view him. And Aquaman makes that case the entire time that he's battling Superman. The entire time they're going toe to toe, he was like, you're not here to help me. Like if you were here to help me, you'd basically tell all these soldiers to stand aside so I can leave, I can go back to Atlantis and I can solve this problem. He was like, I'm the black sheep of the Justice League. No one cares. If tomorrow I left the Justice League, no one would care. They would say, well, thanks for your service, Aquaman. It's been real, it's been good, but it ain't been real good, you know, and he would go back to his thing. He would just go back to Atlantis. That's how he sees himself. But Superman's like, dude, that's not the case. You're just as much of a contributing member of the Justice League as anybody else. And that's true. Because when you look at the Justice League for what they are, like if anybody's like the weakest member of the team, it's Batman. Like, yeah, Batman has gadgets and so on and so forth. All you have to do is shoot Batman with a gun and he's gone. That's it. Shoot Batman with a gun. Like all you have to do is figure out that Batman's Bruce Wayne, and then you put a guy on top of a building, you know, half a mile away as Bruce Wayne's walking into, you know, Wayne Industries, walking into the building, and Batman doesn't exist anymore. Done and done. And that's all it takes. That's all it would take. Stab him in the right place, poison his food. You can kill Batman like any normal human being. If anybody's like the weakest person, it's Batman. But much like Batman, Aquaman has a set of skills that make him a necessity for the team. Batman's resources, Batman's intelligence, Batman's ability to plan for virtually any situation makes him the brains behind the operation in the Justice League. Aquaman's ability to go toe-to-toe with some of the strongest fighters in the DC universe. Aquaman's resources with ocean life, the massive monsters that he controls, the Kraken, all these things that could just lay waste to cities across the world. That makes him an invaluable member of the team. And we saw that in Injustice. You know, that was a cool, that's why Injustice, that's why so many Aquaman fans love Injustice, because there's that great standoff between him and Superman. And Aquaman says, look, if the ocean-dwelling cities, if the coastal cities of the world live to see tomorrow, it's because I allow them to. I could just drown them all. I could have the oceans of the world just immerse onto the various continents that you live in, and the cities that you're in are no more. They're gone. They're relics of days gone by, of a society full of hubris and arrogance. That's one of the reasons why Aquaman's so prominent here, and that's what Superman tells him, like, hey man, like you're a necessary aspect of the team. You're necessary here. You're essential here. Now, because of the fact that Aquaman was being attacked by the US military, because of the fact that Aquaman was being held prisoner, Tula, as regent of Atlantis, basically ordered the troops, the drift, the whole 9 yards, to respond and basically retrieve Aquaman. The funny thing is, they arrive in the middle of this fight between Aquaman and Superman, and Aquaman's like, dude, stand down, guys. Like, everybody stand down. He looks at Superman and he says, are you gonna stand in my way again, or are you gonna let me solve this problem? And Superman says, fix it or else. And that's what's kind of crazy here, is because it's Superman basically saying, if you don't fix it, we'll fix it for you. Like, we will take care of Atlantis for you. Now, this is not Superman saying, I'm going to destroy Atlantis. It's Superman basically saying, there's nothing I can do. Because keep in mind, Superman, like his huge thing, this pre-New 52 Superman in the New 52, his thing is, we as superheroes are not above the law. If we consider ourselves to operate out of the United States, if we consider ourselves US citizens, we have to abide by US law. Superman could say, look, if you do not solve this problem, the president's gonna press the panic button and nukes are gonna come flying into Atlantis. He says, sure, I could stop them, but what I'm doing is I'm going rogue against the president of the United States. I'm an insurgent. I am a unlawful military combatant. I'm a traitor. And so he says, I can't do that. If you do not solve this, the US military will invade Atlantis and there'll be nothing I can do to stop them. Now, of course, that's one of the reasons why everything's kind of weird, or it may also mean that Superman is going to kill Aquaman. I don't know if I'd want to see a fight to the death. I think it'd be kind of weird. But transitioning back to Black Manta for the last tail bit of this discussion here, of course, spending time with Blackjack and so on, he's basically taken to the leader of Nemo. And the leader of Nemo is basically just this old guy. Now, this dude does not ring a bell. He does not seem familiar. And it seems as though he's basically just, you know, maybe he is Nemo himself, but the point that he's making, or at least what he says, is we are an organization that operates behind the scenes. We are an organization that basically pulls the strings on various you know, countries around the world. It's really kind of interesting because this seems very similar to like Checkmate from DC Comics, or like the Hellfire Club from Marvel Comics, in the sense that they're the hidden hand in a lot of different ways. What Black Manta says is, I want to have a say. If you're bringing me into your organization, I want to have a part of what goes on. Well, this guy's response is, well, that's ridiculous. We've existed for thousands of years. At no point has a new guy come in and had any influence on what we do, because our plans are laid out years and years in advance. In response to this, Black Manta kills him and takes his place as king. And so right now, Black Manta is running his own organization called Nemo. And this is cool because it gives him purpose. It gives him his own team. It gives him his own direction. You know, he can now kind of operate from the shadows. He can send his own forces out. It gives DC the ability to build him up into something a lot more dangerous than a guy who just hates Aquaman and fights him all the time. But if you're all new here to to Rob Explains to Comics Explained. Make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.